Hi, everyone. I see folks are joining our really exciting webinar tonight. I'm going to give folks a little bit of time to get into the room, and then we will get started. Hi, Alexandria from Virginia. Oh, sorry, it's from Alexandria, Virginia. My apologies. Well, this is so exciting to see all the places that people are coming from. Looks like we have some folks from West Virginia and California, New Jersey. Hi, Delphine. Folks from Minnesota, Tulsa. We're so excited to have all of you join us this evening. As people are entering, I'll repeat this later, we are really hoping to have a engaging and active conversation that involves everyone who's in the room. So please use the chat, and also for your questions, please put them in the question and answer. Dr. Richie and I will be looking at that, and we'll do our best to bring questions into our conversation. And of course, we have a question and answer section set up at the end. So if your question doesn't get addressed, we'll make sure that we get to it at the end. We have folks from Oregon, Seattle, West Coast is represented. And we have Michigan, my home state. All right, well, it's 7:03. And we know that folks are continuing to come into the room, but we will get started. So hello and good evening. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for the National Black Women's Justice Institute's inaugural book club discussion series event. I am Sydney McKinney, the executive director. For those of you who are new to the organization, the National Black Women's Justice Institute, or NBWJI for short, we research, elevate, and educate the public about innovative, community-led solutions to address the criminalization of Black women and girls. We aim to dismantle the racist and sexist paradigm on which the US criminal legal system is founded and build in its place pathways to opportunity and healing. We envision a society that respects, values, and honors the humanity of Black women and girls, takes accountability for the harm it has inflicted, and recognizes that real justice is healing. This year, for Black History Month, we shared a reading list. We highlighted books by Black women that show the real impact of criminalizing, punishing, and incarcerating Black women and girls. As part of our work to educate and elevate the issues and educate people about the criminalization of Black women and girls, we launched a virtual book club accompanied by a discussion series with the authors. And that's what you're joining us for today. For our first book, we selected Arrested Justice, Black Women, Violence, and America's Prison Nation by Dr. Beth Richie. In this book, Dr. Richie argues that the expansion and dominance of the prison nation over the last decades has led to the violence that Black women and girls experience in their homes, their communities, and by state institutions. And it explains why the violence has been marginalized and ignored by the public, including the mainstream movement to end violence against women. As a result, Black women and girls who have experienced male violence are often vilified, criminalized, and held responsible for the harm they have experienced, instead of supported and protected. Dr. Richie is a prolific activist scholar who has been foundational and transformative for many of us on a personal and professional level. Dr. Richie is the head of the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice, and a professor of African American Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, a university I almost went to and apparently should have. The emphasis of her scholarly and activist work has been on the ways that race and ethnicity and social position affect women's experiences of violence and incarceration, focusing on the experiences of African American battered women and sexual assault survivors. Her earlier book, Compelled to Justice: The Gender Entrapment of Black Battered Women, is taught in many college courses and is cited in the popular press for its original arguments concerning race, gender, and crime. Dr. Richie is a board member of the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African Community, the National Network for Women in Prison, A Call to Men, and a founding member of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. She was also appointed as a senior advisor to the NFL to work on their domestic violence and sexual assault prevention program. She is amazing. Her work is inspiring, and I'm sure that I'm not the only person who's having a little bit of a fangirl moment that we are having this conversation tonight. Dr. Richie, it is an honor, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. I am thrilled, almost beyond words, to be here. I have deep, deep admiration for your work, and really also for you personally, Dr. McKinney. I mean, we could maybe be Sydney and Beth in this, but Dr. McKinney, indeed, for the leadership that you're providing to this amazing organization. So thanks for having me.
Thank you. And just to reiterate, before we jump into the questions, I just want to reiterate for folks, please drop your questions into the Q&A. We will be engaging with that. And if we don't get to it, we will definitely get to it at the end. So make sure you put your questions in the Q&A. All right, so my first question, we'll kick this off. Arrested Justice is an incredible book. And my 2-sentence description only scratches the surface of the important issues you elevate that I think are so foundational for understanding the trends in the criminalization and punishment of Black women and girls that are so apparent, I think, to many of us who are here in this room tonight, but as you point out, are unseen and really considered anomalous to the broader public. What inspired you to write this book, and why was it important for you to write this book, Arrested Justice?
Well, good question. Thank you. And greetings to everyone from all kinds of places. It is nice to see where people are from, and I love seeing familiar names as well as new people to me, maybe not to this discussion. So I consider myself to be a movement activist. And I say that because I really grew up politically in the space between racial justice organizing and the effort to end gender-based violence, the space between that. I came to the work when I realized that the organizations that I was working with, this was 30 or more years ago, 30, almost 40 years ago, the organizations that I was working with, Sydney, either had a very sharp focus on ending structural racism, attending to education, healthcare, employment, the environment, strong emphasis on ending structural racism and white supremacy, or organizations that I was involved with ending the tyranny of gender-based violence, violence against women, girls, and gender non-conforming people. So there was these groups, that I found myself engaged with, deeply politically committed to. And some of you, of course, know the book, This Bridge Called My Back. I felt like I and the other people I was working with, the sisters I was working with, I felt like it was our back that was this bridge between racial justice work and ending gender oppression. And, I just got worn down. That was a really hard work to do for a long time, because in each space, I kept hearing rhetoric about justice and freedom and ending oppression and liberation of our people, whoever our people were. But the racial justice work did not attend to questions of patriarchy, let alone patriarchal violence. And the gender justice work had a kind of gender essentialist notion of things. All women were the same, and not even all women and gender nonconforming people, but all women shared this plight of oppression that was manifested in rape and battering and sexual harassment and other forms of abuse. And so it seemed to me that after all of this trying to explain why to each of these groups, my insider position in both political formulations led me to write a book to try to speak to the anti-violence movement about the harm that was caused by not just ignoring the trend of criminalization, but actually participating in the buildup of a prison nation. And I thought, because I was an insider, am an insider, you know, I'm talking to like my people. I felt like I was almost obligated by the voices of the women and gender nonconforming people who were ignored and left in harm's way because of the way that the anti-violence movement was doing its work. And that inspiration really was the urgency of the harm, of the danger, of the death that I was witnessing, that we were all witnessing all around us.
And I think that's one of the things that I appreciate so much about this book and your work as a whole is, I think folks who are doing this work, we feel that tension every day, right? I feel like the National Black Women's Justice Institute, that is the tension that we're working against. That how do we help people see that just issues of police brutality and mass incarceration affect Black women as much as they affect Black men, and that those stories are equally as important for us to know. And this, the piece about gender-based violence being so critical to that story and how we make sense of what Black women experience as far as criminalization and punishment. And the challenges around engaging with mainstream gender-based violence organizations to get that recognition for the issues that are so deeply connected to what they're doing, but often not centered or even prioritized.
Right.
So you elevate this really important concept of the prison nation. I'm hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about what the prison nation means to you, and why is it important for us to frame the violence that Black women and girls experience in the context of the prison nation, which you argue is really built on this ever-growing conservatism, legal, political, economic, and social conservatism in this country.
Right, and the widening net of the carceral state. So part of what I want to show by talking about a prison nation is how deeply invested this country is, and our peers around the country, around the world, how deeply invested the state is in punishment as a solution to social problems, including gender-based violence. And a lot of the work on gender-based violence sort of takes a sort of episodic or incident-based response. It's what kind of, how much battering or rates of sexual assault or patterns of sexual harassment. All of those things are important. But if we only look at the individual overt manifestations of violence, we forget, or we choose to ignore, all of the things that make that violence possible. And we in anti-violence organizations often are kind of like trying to catch the moment that someone is in crisis, instead of looking, and in some ways doing that well, instead of looking at the broader pattern that surrounds the violence. And the prison nation is an attempt to move discussions of gender-based violence into the context of the ever-expanding neoliberal, racial capitalist expansion of the carceral state. So it kind of looks like this in some ways. First, it's important, lots of people are safer because anti-violence organizations do their work. Some women aren't hurt as badly, some children don't witness violence, some men aren't arrested. There is a subgroup of people who are safer because anti-violence organizations do incident-based work. But that's not true of Black women. It's not true of kids of color. It's not true of immigrant men or people with disabilities or people with queer partners or sex workers or addicts. You know, it's not true of most people who experience gender-based violence. And the prison nation says we have to attend to the violence that makes it complicated for Black women because of institutionalized racism. We have to think about what happens for people who are addicts because of how we organize addiction intervention programs to be punishment oriented. It means that survivors who have a felony background aren't going to have access to services because these are crime victims programs, not programs for people who need help, even if they have committed a crime, right? The prison nation says we have to look at schools, welfare offices, hospitals, treatment programs, institutions for people with disabilities. We have to look at all of those places and see how carcerality or punishment or surveillance creeps into how we treat people with the most serious needs, who are facing the most serious harms, including harm by the criminal legal system. And when we turn ourselves around as anti-violence activists and look at the face of the criminal legal system and say, help us respond to the problem of gender-based violence, the only thing that the criminal legal system knows to do is deploy police, incarcerate people, longer sentences, further and further away from where they live, detach people from their community and their family, et cetera. So the prison nation, I'm sorry for the long answer, Sydney, but the prison nation says this is not just about what we do in response to gender-based violence, it's what we do in response to almost everything that affects the most disadvantaged people of in our community. And the one last thing I want to say about that, if we walk with that analysis, that means that part of our work as anti-violence activists is not only to answer hotlines, do support groups, do court advocacy. It's not our work. Our work is also to look at those larger systems that has so many people in harm's way of the mean-spirited and growing, widening net of the criminal legal system. That's what the prison nation says. We got to put our work in that space.
Thank you so much for that response. And it was perfect and never too long. I could listen to you speak for hours. And what you said answered my next question that I had for you. I was really struck in your book that you talk about male violence happening at 3 levels, right? There's the interpersonal violence, which is, I think, the kind of violence that folks typically associate with male violence that, you know, women and gender nonconforming people might experience. But you take it to framing it around community-based violence and state violence, which is not typically how we think about and frame male violence. At first blush, it's, you know, like, oh, but you take a second, and I think every one of us who are here on this call can imagine or may have experienced male violence operating at the community and or state institutional level. And so I really appreciate the prison nation as a framework for us that forces us to think about how violence operates at these different levels and affects women and girls and gender nonconforming people on a deeply personal level, and really shapes our lives, our outcomes, the resources and supports that are not available to us. I think it's such an important framework for us to not just think about the individual, but also take a step up and understand how these larger systemic and structural institutions and processes and policies are at work shaping the lives of people in our communities. Um, so thank you so much for that. I also, another thing that you bring up in your book is about the vilification of women, Black women who are survivors of violence instead of being protected. We see this in our work at NBWJI, and there are sadly a number of recent examples where this has occurred. I think of Micaiah Bryant, who in Ohio called the police for help and was shot and killed. I think about the 9-year-old girl in Rochester, New York, who earlier this year was in the midst of emotional distress and was pepper sprayed in the back of a police car. These are all instances where Black young people are seeking help. And police come and they're harmed, right? They're seen as the the person who needs to be dealt with, right? Instead of the person who needs to be helped and supported and protected. And so I hope you can talk to us a little bit about how the prison nation kind of creates this dynamic where we can be seeking help and yet are viewed and perceived as the problem that needs to be managed and controlled and punished, and sadly sometimes killed.
Yeah, sadly sometimes killed, and even if not a literal death, certainly a kind of emotional, social death that is just surrounding us, and the overwhelming optics and bombardment of how Black women, let's just stay there for a minute, how Black women and girls are so expendable and made to be non-humans. Um, Sort of, moves me almost beyond words, moves me to tears often. And that's part of why I think the anti-violence movement has to be held accountable for its part in not seeing that and not feeling that death that's about our lives. Um, so, so I think a couple of things. One is a prison nation is in part, it's a political being. It's deeply organized to reinforce white supremacy, patriarchy, racial capitalism. Like, it's there to make the whole structure of inequality and premature death possible. And it's legitimate because it's lodged in the law, the criminal legal system, which is purported to have sort of a neutral impact. And so it's, for some people, probably not the 117 people on this call, but the next 117, it's pretty hard sometimes to peel away why the system that has the word justice in it is so powerfully invoked as harm doing to so many people. So, we have to kind of start there at some point and demystify what that system really looks like. And the best way to do that, I think, is to sort of take one glance over the wall of any jail or prison or detention center and see the extreme concentration of disadvantage of disadvantaged people, right? Overrepresentation of disadvantaged people. And it's the same populations, the same communities that are disadvantaged on the other side of that wall. And so the equation is almost perfect, and it doesn't take brilliant social scientists to see that what we have done is decided by policy to contain, to dehumanize, to cage, to strip life from people who we think are expendable in service of the buildup of a prison nation. So it's calculated and it's intentional. And all of that was happening. All of that was happening as the anti-violence movement was starting to really become more powerful in the mainstream imaginary. And I often describe it as sort of like a train, because it was like a train wreck. Um, the crime bills, and there's several of them. People often say the 1996 crime bill, there was 1998 crime bill. There were a series of legislative policies that absolutely contributed to the mass criminalization that we're facing now. And right alongside of that, like I guess, second car of the train was the anti-violence movement. And we were hooked up tight to that engine driving down the train track. And our work was propelled forward. Like lots of people paid attention to violence against women because we were introduced into the mainstream narrative about crime and justice and public safety and those kinds of things. And so part of what happened, in order for that train to run, you've got to have some people who are kind of pushing it along. And the people pushing it along were people who had more mainstream power, white feminists, white carceral feminists, but you also have to have people to leave behind. There's got to be a there. And I think we were sacrificed. And not maybe personally sacrificed, but the position in relationship to injustice. Black people, queer people, disabled people, immigrants were sacrificed in order for that train to keep moving. And I don't even remember what your original question was, but that's what prompted, I was prompted to sort of share that analogy, that the prison nation only works if you have people to sacrifice and fill up those spaces. And we were there, vulnerable and not protected by anybody, including our anti-violence feminist sister activists who didn't intervene at best as policies were criminalizing Black women and girls.
Those are such important points that make me think about just how many women who are incarcerated are survivors of sexual violence. I mean, to your point, these are women who the anti-violence movement should be supporting, should have supported, right? And yet they are incarcerated. They are in our prisons, they are in our jails. And, the statistics are ridiculously disturbing and insane. I think
Right.
The one that's most often quoted is 86%, but I have seen different studies with different samples quoting as high as 90 and 75%, no matter what the actual statistic is, if we were to bring all of these samples together, it is disturbingly high. And we are not talking about it. And like you said, these are folks who have been sacrificed. They are literally behind bars, and what they've experienced as far as gender-based violence is not recognized. And you point this out in your book, that even like when they return home, their access to services are limited, and their ability to access victim services are significantly constrained because of policies that prevent people who have convictions from accessing services, or because there are these expectations that people must support or be party to prosecutions, right? Like there are all of these barriers that for women who have been criminalized and are survivors, that really keep them and keep them away and deny them access to services and supports that they so desperately need, right? Like probably more than so many other populations, and they don't have access. So it's heartbreaking.
One of the can I jump in? I want to
Of
say,
course.
So for anyone who's listening who works in an anti-violence program, I do want you to hear that important work happens in those programs. and that's a period, there's no but after that, important work happens in those programs. Tremendous pain, harm, destruction, and death happens outside of those programs. And if you want to know where the outside is that we should go first, it is to women who have been criminalized for their attempts to survive. And I also try to read the data about the number of incarcerated women who have a history of trauma. I have I've never met a Black woman in prison who had not experienced some kind of gender-based violence. And not just like once, but over the course of a lifetime from multiple sources, individual groups of people, schools, at their job, if they had a job, on the streets, if they worked on the streets. That's part of what led me to talk about the violence matrix, that the violence is profound, it's persistent, and it comes from all kinds of places. And that's the experience of people who are incarcerated, especially incarcerated in women's prisons because of the abuse. Sometimes it's a direct path, like the abuse led to the arrest of a woman, but sometimes it's a less direct path, but very quickly in any conversation that I have had, there is some trauma, some either individual violence, state violence that led to directly the path to that cage that they're living in now. And it's really important, I think, for us as anti-violence activists to say, why would we let that happen? That's not news that there are people who need, even if we think the right answer is a support group, why aren't we doing support groups inside? Why are we not attending to those who need us most? And I sort of offer that up as a loving, appreciative, urgent critique of where we find ourselves doing our work. And I know for myself, when the funding became available, because there was so much attention to what was happening on college campuses, and because I'm on a college campus, I'm keenly aware of the violence that happens on college campuses. So much attention to it, so many resources toward it, so much policy developed around it. And so many more women in jails and prisons and locked treatment facilities and detention centers, and no attention, no resources, very little research, hardly any funding to respond. And that, again, that's intentional. I mean, you can't argue with who the different populations are and the different priorities on their lives are based on how the anti-violence movement champions what cause it is that we will take up. There are some amazing programs now that I really hope people know about. If you don't, look up Survived and Punished. Amazing work. Most cities have some program for criminalized survivors. It's often led by people who are sex workers and are looking at harm reduction approaches. So we can do this. We can find this work. There are leaders who are reimagining it. It requires that we shift our gaze. We, meaning the mainstream anti-violence movement, shift our gaze away from what we've done to what we need to be doing urgently now.
I'm going to jump to a few questions that I see in the chat that I think are really interesting. One person, Medina, asks, what are your takes on the hashtag protect Black women or hashtag protect Black girls phrase compared to the hashtag defend Black women and hashtag defend Black girls phrase as it pertains to policy, I think it's police brutality and state-sanctioned violence against Black women and girls that they endure. There's been a lot of pushback on the protect phrase due to the paternalistic connotation, which has caused many to adopt the phrase defend instead. And she would love to hear your thoughts.
What a great question. I almost want to say, what do you think? Yeah, so I'm 64. So hashtag anything is a different approach to political marking of space. What I appreciate about it is not that I know how to sort of use it, but what I appreciate about what it does is puts it right out there, how you feel and what you think needs to happen. So that's a good thing. Um, the second thing I want to say before I answer that is I identify very strongly as an abolition feminist. And I do that because for me, any hashtag or any campaign or any intervention has to include what we're trying to tear down, who we're trying to set free, what we're trying to interrupt, what we're trying to stop, and also what we're trying to build. And for me, defend feels like what we're trying to build, if that's what it feels like. And I say this knowing that what actually happens within the context of a political campaign, is different depending on who's doing it, right? But protect to me sounds like what we want to do to stop people from being hurt and harmed. And I think we want to do that. And that's not enough. We need to not just be safe, we need to be free. And protect sounds like keep us safe. Defend sounds like set us free or help us be free. Let us find our freedom. And I think again, whatever the hashtag is, it has to include in the campaign tearing down, but also building up, imagining a different world where we don't need to be protected because we're free.
Thank you. Um, I love that so much, that we don't need to be protected because we are free. And I think, that as a Black woman, I relate to on so many levels. And I feel like it's the work that brought me to this organization, and why I'm so proud to be leading the work that we do here. We have another question from Janae Bonsu. Janae would like to know, would you say that quote unquote male violence is interchangeable with the notion of patriarchal violence? She says, I'm thinking about the ways that internalized patriarchy manifests as violence in people who are not male, example, female correctional officers, as well as how patriarchy harms queer males and trans men, example, cis hetero men who terrorize gay men, and wondering if those instances would be characterized as male violence.
Hi, Janae. If I were writing this book now, it wouldn't say male violence. It would say patriarchal violence. And I share that, because our thinking changes as time goes on. We learn more, we listen more, we are accountable for ways that what we called something, wasn't right because it didn't reflect the full experience. And it's hard when the words on the cover of the book, if it were just in the book, I could say, well, I really meant, but now I have to go find all the books and cross that out and move forward. And it actually wasn't long after Arrested Justice was published where I had a moving discussion with a group of Black trans people about the title of the book. And, again, it was too late to reprint, but, I humbly accepted that it signaled something that I didn't want it to. Patriarchal violence is a much better frame for what I'm talking about and what I think we need to do. There's also, in my head, no, it's not really in my head, it's more in my heart, a somewhat unresolved place where I want to talk to people who are of my generation activists about what we did when we tried to put a name on what we were seeing and hearing about domestic violence or wife abuse. I mean, there was wife abuse before domestic violence, and battered women. And, there's all of these sort of relics of how the work that we were doing, was organized around what we thought people would understand, as opposed to what we sort of really knew deep in our heart it was. And so, yes, I think patriarchal violence works much better for all the reasons that you said, Janae. And I also hope that I am modeling that it's really right to say when you changed your mind because you learned something. Yeah.
It's a great question, and I love your answer because it's something that I think a lot about with our organization. What's the language that we use and what does it signal? And to your point, that may change over time, and it is important for it to change and for us to be able to reflect on those moments when the language wasn't quite right and maybe was alienating unintentionally so. It just highlights how important language is and how important it is for us to take into consideration the language that we are using. And I think it's, particularly in this area of work, how important language is just critical.
Right.
It also, I think, raises these questions that I know I've been kind of trying to figure out of there's language that we use internally with folks who are kind of in this work.
Right.
And then what's the language that we use when we're talking to the folks who are not with us just yet and as knowledgeable about some of these issues, right? And sometimes there's a tension there.
I'm writing down an idea that I had that someone I think needs to write about how patriarchal violence affects people beyond the obvious objects, which feels for some people like women. I think the way that Janae weaved the question out kind of answers it, but I do think that we don't want to lose the patriarchal nature, because it is it is patriarchy, even though the subjects or objects of the violence aren't only people who are typically thought to suffer under patriarchy, if you will. I think it's a complicating way to think about our work that is yet to be formulated.
Definitely. One thing I really have been dying to ask and talk to you about is gender-based police brutality that is clearly gender-based violence and yet is never named as such. Mm-hmm. I was so disturbed by the story of Anjanette Young, who is in Chicago, who is a woman whose house was wrongfully raided by police and was forced to stand naked in her living room while they searched her home. And for folks who saw this video, it was incredibly disturbing how they just looked at her body and didn't see her body. She was just non-existent and dehumanized in that process. And I remember being horrified by news outlets that were talking about this and saying, oh, how humiliating of an experience. And all I could think was, I feel like I'm seeing a woman in a frat house who's standing naked and being sexually assaulted. And yet that isn't the way that we talk about this. And so there are also instances of women who are in correctional facilities who, whose bodies are touched, who are asked to, take off their clothes when they're in the midst of their menstrual cycle. There are real forms. These are, I think, in any other context, we would not question that these are forms of gender-based violence, but because they are perpetrated by state actors, police, or people who work in these facilities, they're kind of written off and taken for granted as just like normal business, right? Like that's how the work gets done.
Right.
I'm hoping like if you could just like talk a little bit about that, because I just, it's kind of mind boggling.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a whole like long, fiery discussion, isn't it? That, the ways that under the guise of policing, and I'm talking about policing both in the community and policing inside prisons, there is complete authority and almost responsibility for using gender-based violence to create safety. And the example that you gave, is again just so blatant, um, that a Black woman would have to stand naked while police tore up her apartment, and then that video would be shown over and over again in mainstream media, like the levels, right? The same way that women have to be strip searched after a visit. So in order to have the privilege, not the right, the privilege of a visit, you have to be strip searched after. And let's go back to talking about how many people in prison have experienced sexual abuse. And so every strip search is another example, right, of humiliating, degrading abuse. And if we look at it that way, prisons and policing are gender violence. They are gender violence. They operate to give arbitrary control to the state to use violence as a way to get its work done, to get its work done. And I think that's really, we have to sort of step back and look at that. And then again, it raises this question, what are we doing as anti-violence activists in that space? The brilliant work of Andrea Ritchie, certainly the work of, Monique Morris. I mean, there's lots of people who are talking about how the institutions themselves breed the violence. They operate using the violence. The surveillance is the violence itself. Why would we ever think that the violence would solve the violence, right? The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. Audre Lorde told us that, and we need to really believe it and realize it. And all we need to do is talk to almost any person arrested, and this includes male identified men who are arrested, in the ways that sexual degradation is part of the process, the authorized process, would compel us to find a different place or a different way to do our work. And one of the things when you first asked the question, why police brutality isn't thought of as a gender-based issue, I think it's almost that racial justice activists got there first, claimed it as almost the hallmark of what racial justice work is. And people who work on gender justice either said, well, I guess they got that. That's their domain. Let's stay in our lane. Or couldn't find a way to immerse even a little bit of feminism in that racial justice work. So, I think it is the case that gender just, and and again, you all know this, I'm talking now to all these people here, I'm painting sort of a more bleak picture than it is, because I'm sure many of you, probably all of you, work in many different domains to do your work. I'm talking in a more general sense to make the point that I think once an issue is claimed by an ideological movement or a political movement, it's often very difficult. We don't do intersectionality well. We don't share political space well. We aren't willing to learn and teach and step back. It's why I think I say this every time. That's why I think the critical resistance insight statement, which is a promise, it's a commitment, it's aspiration to work together to end the PIC, the prison industrial complex, and also challenge gender-based violence. it's like, we promise we're going to do this together, right? The examples like that are so important because it means we can do the work better.
And I think you're so right. Like, we have to do this work together. And it is, being in this work, I've been so appreciative of the different networks and the different partners that we have engaged, because there is no way that NBWJI by itself can make these monumental changes that are necessary. We all have to be working together to be able to do it. So thank you so much for that. I'm curious, we're kind of getting towards the end of our time, but I'm curious about, how do you view our current moment? Do you think we're at risk of seeing the expansion of the prison nation? Are we in the midst of the expansion of the prison nation? Are we seeing the weakening of the prison nation? I ask this in part because one of the things that you point out just so wonderfully in your book is about how the mainstreaming of the anti-violence movement really shut out and resulted in violence and the vilification of Black women and girls, and that co-optation of the movement really left out folks.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, in this moment when there's so much talk about reimagining policing and talking about criminal justice reform, people are using this terminology in ways that a year ago they weren't.
Right.
Are we in the midst of potentially that being co-opted, and it becoming potentially succumbing to the same kind of challenges and limitations of the anti-violence movement that you describe?
So I so appreciate the question, and I'll when I'm talking with you, because I so admire the National Black Women's Justice Institute. I can't remember what the initials are, because I think of you as your whole name, because your whole name is all of that. I feel really hopeful. I feel like arrested justice and the work that many people, not just me as the author of that book, but so many people who influenced each other, when we were doing this work, I think the world's different. I think the world's different now. And I think there are a lot more organizations that are kind of standing or moving in their own space about justice, about Black justice, that includes a feminist analysis. I'm really optimistic. And I think the optimism comes because I think there's an opening, but the opening itself isn't what makes me feel optimistic. Opening, and then people are ready to move in. And the ready to move in is what inspires me. And I think it's important, at least it is important for me, that there's so many more people who claim the identity of abolitionists, which is, for someone who has, sort of said that's who I am for a long time, I love it every time I hear it. And I want to know what it means to people. I want to know what historical analysis has led people to that, not just last summer, but for the last 15 years, for the last 30 years, for the last, 85 years. Like, there is, to me, something about an opening and then people ready to move. And the generation of organizations that I think you represent, for me, is what gives me hope. But that's also because I'm talking to you tonight. When we're done and there's another world, right? I think we have to be really careful. We have to be really careful. We have to be careful to not just open up and not have anybody ready. We got to be ready. We have to be ready. We have to be careful not to exhaust ourselves and not have a place to have love and joy and replenishment and victory. We have to be careful not to tear each other down. You know, we have to, I think there's a generosity piece about mistakes that people are going to make and how we're going to handle those and what's our accountability structure when people make mistakes. You know, so I think it's got to be, there's got to be a deepening, if you will, of what we're signing up for if we're going to move to the next phase. I think we can do it now. I think we have to do it now. We have to try to do it now. And I think we have to do it thoughtfully and carefully and generously and humbly, because it's real serious. You know, I mean, it's really, really serious. We know that people are going to die, and we have to take each death or near death or symbolic death as seriously as we can, because this is life and death work.
It is. We are coming up so close to the end of our time, and we have questions. I'm wondering, Dr. Richie, if you would stick around to answer just one or two more.
I will stick around. Yeah, I'll stick around.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. So one question comes from Zora. She asks, how should we think of the role of welfare institutions in the criminalization of Black women? When we study the lives of incarcerated survivors, we see how state agencies failed them all along the way. These welfare institutions can both mitigate and exacerbate harm, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. If abolition is a presence, we need an abundance of public care, but welfare institutions as they currently exist don't always live up to that promise.
Well, that's I know it's not a yes or it's a big question, but it's actually really a very my answer will be very straightforward. I think, as I was suggesting earlier, a prison nation requires a carceral approach way outside of the walls. And one of the first places that I think carcerality creeps, I'm borrowing a term that Mimi Kim uses, one of the first places that carcerality creeps is in welfare organizations. Creeps into social services, it creeps into schools, indeed, it creeps into treatment programs, it really creeps into, because of our relationship to capitalism in this country, the position of programs that are designed to help people, well, they're not designed, I was going to say designed to help people deal with wealth inequality. I don't think that's what wealth, I mean, that's what they should do, but that's not what they do. Instead, they legitimize wealth inequality by criminalizing people who need basic resources to survive. So, yeah, a serious indictment of welfare agencies. Yeah.
Thank you. I 100% agree. I worked at a foster care agency for a number of years before joining NBWJI, and it's horrifying.
Yeah.
It's really horrifying what is done to families, what is done to children, and yeah, you know, I feel like we could talk about welfare, child welfare, for a very long time. To wrap us up, and I just want to say thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation. I don't know if you're looking at the chat right now, but we're getting responses like, thank you so much, very insightful. Lee Goodmark says, as always, awed, energized, and inspired. I agree with that. That is how I feel right now. I feel so inspired by this conversation that we had, as well as just like my resolve and commitment to this work just being strengthened. And I thank you so much, because what a wonderful conversation to kick off our book club discussion series. You and the work that you do is so incredibly powerful. And like I said at the beginning, has been just so foundational and transformative for so many of us. Thank you so much. And I wish I'd gone to the University of Illinois at Chicago.
I wish we had too, but I want to also just again really thank you and thank everyone who's here. I see lots of names I know. It makes me feel really excited that we're continuing to talk about how to do this work better, differently, more urgent, and congratulations to the organization, to your work, and can't wait to hear what the next book is. I'll be in the audience.
Yay. Well, then thank you for that wonderful segue.
Yeah.
Our next book is going to be A Little Piece of Light by Donna Hilton, who is actually on this call with us tonight. She has also authored a really powerful and incredible op-ed that can be found in the Gotham Gazette. We're going to drop a link into that so folks can read that. But A Little Piece of Light is about her life, including the 27 years she spent locked up behind bars in a New York State maximum security prison. Please pick up the book. Please join us in our virtual book club, engage in our social media, and really help us elevate and lift up these issues about the criminalization of Black women and girls. And we're really trying to center system impacted Black women and girls in our conversations about mass incarceration. We need to be talking about women and girls when we are talking about mass incarceration. And so please help us do that by engaging in our social media and our conversations about our next book. We will be scheduling that conversation in June, so stay tuned for the save the date. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Richie. This has been incredible and has made my day, my week, my month, because we are reaching the end of April. So just thank you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. I appreciate you all deeply. Greetings to all of you on the chat and in the space. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely night and take good care.